For 14 years, marine dog handler Abby Walker never missed her Sunday call home. Then, for 3 weeks, her parents stopped answering. Messages she received were short, cold, and nothing like her mother. Abby returned to the Montana ranch with Ranger, her German Shepherd and military partner. The moment they arrived, Ranger ignored the house and raced toward the woodshed, where Abby found her father unconscious beside an axe. But that was only the first warning. The ranch had been divided. Equipment was missing. Survey flags marked the western pasture, and someone was entering the property at night. When Ranger uncovered a hidden box of contracts beneath an abandoned sheep barn, Abby discovered that her family was not merely in debt. Someone had been preparing to take everything they owned. Then, before dawn, the bulldozers arrived. This time, Ranger was not searching for an enemy overseas. He was protecting home. Every life carries a story, and every one of us deserves a place to share what lies within our hearts. You are here with Porchlight Stories, where every life is welcomed beneath the warm glow of the porchlight. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another heartfelt story. Please stay with us until the very end. If today's story touches your heart, give the video a like and subscribe to support the channel. And if there is anything we could do better, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. And now, let's begin. On Sunday, October 26, 2025, the first breath of winter moved through Elk Hollow, Montana. Low clouds pressed against the Bitterroot Mountains, cottonwood leaves skittered along Main Street, and wood smoke settled over the valley as families gathered indoors. Nearly 900 miles away, Abigail Walker sat in temporary military housing outside Camp Pendleton, California, watching her phone change to 7. At 42, Abby had spent 20 years learning how to wait without appearing impatient. She was tall and lean, with strong shoulders, dark brown hair tied in a low knot, gray-green eyes, and a faint scar beneath her chin from a training accident. Quiet by nature, she trusted observation more than explanation. That habit had made her an excellent marine dog handler, but it had also allowed her to mistake distance from home for proof that everything there remained unchanged. For 14 years, she had called her parents every Sunday at exactly 7. Her mother, Ruth Walker, always answered first. Ruth was 69, small and graceful, with silver hair braided over one shoulder, and warm brown eyes that made nervous people feel safe. A retired elementary school teacher, she still spoke with patient encouragement, even when life gave her little reason for optimism. During every call, she held the same blue ceramic mug with a chipped rim. Thomas Walker, Abby's 73-year-old father, usually appeared behind her. He was a tall, weathered rancher with broad hands, a white mustache, and shoulders permanently bent by decades of lifting feed sacks and repairing fences. He disliked cameras, but he always stayed long enough to ask one question. Does Ranger still remember the way home? Ranger always lifted his head when he heard his name. The 8-year-old German Shepherd lay beside Abby's chair now. His black and tan coat remained thick, though silver had spread across his muzzle. A small notch marked his left ear, and his rear hip stiffened in cold weather. Ranger had worked beside Abby for 6 years as a military tracking and protection dog. He was neither magical nor fearless. He simply noticed what people overlooked and trusted Abby enough to warn her. At 7, Abby called. The screen rang until the call ended. She tried again. No answer. It was the 3rd Sunday in a row. After the first missed call, Ruth had sent a message. We're fine, don't worry. After the second came another. Your father is resting, everything is fine. The periods bothered Abby. Her mother used too many exclamation marks, never too few. Ruth ended grocery reminders with hearts and weather reports with smiling faces. She would not write everything is fine like a stranger closing a conversation. Abby was completing her transition from active service. A private security company in San Diego had offered her a well-paid position directing its working dog program. She declined it the next morning. By noon, her bags were in her dark green pickup. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat with the dignity of an aging soldier unwilling to admit his joints hurt. Abby pointed the truck north. 2 days later, Montana received them beneath a gray afternoon sky. The road into Elk Hollow passed harvested fields, weathered barns, and narrow creeks edged with early ice. The Walker Ranch sat 7 miles beyond town, beneath the rising foothills. The front gate leaned inward. The wooden Walker Ranch sign hung crooked from one chain. Weeds filled the roadside ditch, a fence section sagged, and the pasture grass stood pale and thin. Ranger rose in his seat. When Abby stopped beside the farmhouse, she expected him to race toward the porch. On earlier visits, he had always found Thomas, who secretly carried dried venison in his coat pocket. This time, Ranger stepped onto the gravel and froze. His ears turned toward the equipment shed beyond the barn. His nose lifted. Then he ran. "Ranger!" Abby followed. Behind the shed, split firewood lay scattered across the ground. An axe rested beside a fallen man. "Dad!" Thomas lay between 2 logs, one hand still curled around the hickory handle. His face had gone pale. Ranger reached him first, pressed his nose beneath Thomas's jaw, and licked his cheek. When Thomas did not move, the dog barked sharply and looked back at Abby. She dropped to her knees. Thomas was breathing, but his pulse fluttered beneath her fingers, uneven and too fast. The farmhouse door opened. Ruth ran across the yard in a faded blue apron and worn house shoes, her braid coming loose behind her. "He said he was only bringing in wood." "When did he eat?" Ruth hesitated. "This morning, a little oatmeal." Abby sent her for Thomas's glucose meter and medication box. His blood sugar was dangerously low, and several compartments in the box were empty. Abby gave him glucose gel from the truck's emergency kit, covered him with a blanket, and kept speaking until his eyes opened. Thomas looked at Ranger first. "Well," he whispered, "I suppose you remembered?" Inside, Thomas rested beneath 2 quilts, while Ranger lay beside the sofa, one paw touching the rancher's boot. Ruth made tea she never drank. The truth emerged slowly. Thomas's heart medication had become more expensive after their insurance changed. His doctor had warned that missed doses could worsen the irregular heartbeat that followed his stroke. Ruth had been cutting pills in half and skipping some days, so the prescription would last until the end of the month. They had also reduced groceries to cover electricity and property payments. "You could have called me," Abby said. Thomas looked toward the cold fireplace. "You were finishing your service." "I was your daughter before I was a Marine." Neither parent answered. As evening settled, Abby walked through the farmhouse and saw what their smiles had hidden. The furnace no longer worked. A portable heater stood unplugged near the sofa. The refrigerator held half a carton of eggs, a jar of pickles, and a pot of thin vegetable soup. Several family photographs had been removed from the dining room wall, revealing dark moisture stains across the wood. Ruth followed her gaze. "It has only been a difficult season." "A season doesn't empty a medicine box." Thomas shifted beneath the quilts. "We've handled worse." That sentence had carried the Walkers through droughts, funerals, and failed harvests. Tonight it sounded less like courage and more like a locked door. The old house seemed to hold its breath around them. Hours later, Ruth slept in a chair beside Thomas. Abby lay awake in her childhood bedroom, listening to the wind press against the siding. At 1:17 in the morning, Ranger rose from the rug. He walked into the hallway and stopped before Thomas's old study. The room had always held ranch ledgers, maps, and the cedar desk where Abby once completed her schoolwork. Thomas had never locked it. Ranger lowered his nose to the gap beneath the door. The fur along his shoulders lifted. A low growl formed in his chest. Abby reached for the handle. It would not turn. Ranger looked up at her, waiting. Someone had locked Thomas Walker's study. Who had entered that room, and what was Abby's family trying so desperately to hide? Wednesday morning arrived beneath a thin layer of frost. The sky above Elk Hollow was pale and cloudless, but the October sun carried little warmth, leaving the roofs, fence rails, and empty water troughs silvered with ice. Abby had slept less than 2 hours. Before dawn, she had considered forcing open the locked study, but Thomas was still weak. Ruth was sleeping beside him, and Ranger had eventually settled outside the door without giving another warning. Abby decided that whatever waited inside could remain there until she understood the rest of the ranch. Years in the Marines had taught her not to rush through the first suspicious doorway when the entire landscape might be trying to tell a larger story. By 7, Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table beneath 2 layers of flannel, pretending the previous afternoon had been nothing more than an inconvenient nap. Ruth placed oatmeal before him and watched until he swallowed the first spoonful. Ranger lay across the doorway, positioned where he could see both Thomas and Abby. When Abby asked about the locked study, her father stared into his coffee. "The latch has been sticking," he said. It was not an answer, and all 3 of them knew it. Abby did not challenge him. Instead, she pulled on her olive field jacket and walked outside with Ranger. She began at the main house and moved outward in widening circles, examining the property as she once inspected temporary camps after patrols. She noted what had changed, what was missing, and what someone had attempted to hide. The front gate had been repaired with wire instead of bolts. 3 sections of irrigation pipe had been removed. Several cattle pens were empty, their floors swept unusually clean. In the equipment shed, broad, pale shapes marked the concrete where heavy machinery had stood for years. The restored John Deere tractor Thomas once polished every spring was gone. So were the hay baler and the red livestock trailer Abby remembered using to transport her first horse to the county fair. Only an aging utility tractor remained, its rear tire cracked and nearly flat. Ranger wandered through the empty spaces, sniffing the floor before looking toward Abby as though even he understood that large machines did not simply disappear. Beyond the barn, Abby found the western pasture divided by a fence that had not existed during her last visit. The new cedar posts were straight and solid, far better than anything repaired near the farmhouse. Orange survey ribbons fluttered beyond them, tied to steel stakes driven at regular intervals through the grass. Some markings extended toward the creek, while others climbed the low ridge where the Walker children had once built forts from fallen branches. Thomas came slowly across the yard carrying his cane. The cold had reddened his cheeks, and each step seemed to cost him more than he wanted Abby to notice. "You should be inside," she said. "I have lived through 73 Montana winters. Yesterday you nearly did not make it through one afternoon." Thomas stopped beside the new fence. When Abby asked who had installed it, he answered too quickly. "A neighbor is leasing part of the pasture." "Which neighbor?" "Someone Daniel knows." Abby crouched beside a survey stake. The metal was new, and the orange ribbon bore a printed number rather than a rancher's handwritten mark. "Farmers leasing grazing land don't usually survey drainage lines and road access." Thomas looked toward the mountains instead of at her. "You have been home 1 day, Abby. And in 1 day, I found you unconscious, your medication missing, your furnace broken, and half the equipment gone." His jaw tightened. "We handled things while you were away." "Then tell me what you handled." He did not. Ranger stood between them, watching Thomas with calm brown eyes. After a long silence, the old rancher turned and walked back toward the house. Inside, Ruth had begun kneading bread on the kitchen counter. The room warmed slightly from the oven, and for a few minutes the familiar smell of yeast softened the tension. Ruth moved with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent decades making scarcity look like hospitality. Her blue apron had been patched at the pocket, and she saved every loose piece of flour by brushing it back into the bowl. On the sofa rested 3 unfinished quilts made from old shirts, curtain remnants, and carefully preserved scraps of cotton. Ruth explained that she sold them after Sunday services at Elk Hollow Community Church. She spoke lightly, describing the work as something that kept her hands busy during winter. Abby examined one quilt and recognized pieces from Daniel's childhood shirt, Thomas's old work jacket, and her own yellow bedroom curtains. These were not spare scraps. Ruth was slowly selling the fabric of their family history. When Ruth reached for a rolling pin, Abby noticed the absence of the green stone ring that had remained on her mother's right hand for as long as she could remember. Thomas had given Ruth the small Montana sapphire on their 40th wedding anniversary. Ruth used to joke that it was the only piece of jewelry on the ranch more expensive than a healthy calf. "Where is your ring?" Abby asked. Ruth's hands stopped. "I had the setting repaired." "Where?" "In town." "Which store?" Ruth lowered her eyes. The truth came quietly. She had sold it 6 weeks earlier to pay the overdue electricity bill and purchase Thomas's heart medication. Even then, there had not been enough money to fill the prescription completely. "Your father never knew," she whispered. "He would have tried to sell something else." Abby looked toward the patched quilts and the nearly empty pantry. "Mom, you sold the ring Dad saved 10 years to buy?" Ruth pressed both flour-covered hands against the counter. "A ring cannot keep a house warm." There was no self-pity in her voice, only the practical sorrow of someone who had already cried in private and moved on to the next necessary task. A pickup entered the yard shortly after 3. Ranger rose before the engine stopped. Daniel Walker climbed from the cab and remained beside the truck for several seconds, looking toward Abby as though he had hoped the rumors of her return were wrong. At 47, Daniel was the oldest of the Walker children and the one who most resembled Thomas in his stronger years. He stood over 6 feet tall, with a heavy chest, powerful arms, and a dark beard streaked with premature gray. A pale burn scar crossed the side of his neck, left by the wildfire that had nearly consumed the ranch 3 years earlier. Once known throughout Elk Hollow for his easy laugh and stubborn optimism, Daniel now carried exhaustion like another layer of clothing. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and shadows beneath his blue eyes suggested years of sleeping in short, anxious intervals. He had remained on the ranch when Abby enlisted, and had spent most of his adult life believing that staying made him more loyal than those who left. "You came without calling," he said. "Apparently calling doesn't work anymore." Daniel glanced toward the house. "Mom told me Dad had a spell." "He collapsed because he was rationing medication." His face tightened. "I've been handling it." Abby gestured toward the empty equipment shed. "Is that what handling it looks like?" Daniel walked past her toward the western field. Ranger followed several yards behind, neither friendly nor openly suspicious. At the new fence, Abby demanded to know who owned the land beyond it. Daniel rested both hands on the top rail. "No one owns it except the family." "Then why can't we use it?" "It's temporarily unavailable." "Land doesn't become unavailable by itself." Daniel finally faced her. "You left, Abby. You built a life somewhere else. You don't get to come back after 20 years, walk around for one morning, and act like the rest of us were too stupid to notice things falling apart." The words struck harder because part of them was true. Abby had missed birthdays, surgeries, bad harvests, and the slow aging of both parents. But guilt did not erase what stood in front of her. "I'm not calling you stupid. You don't have to. It's in the way you look at everything." "I'm looking because no one will speak." Daniel stepped closer. His voice remained low, but anger trembled beneath it. "We protected you because you were serving. We had no idea where you were half the time, or whether you would come home at all. And while you were protecting me, Mom sold her wedding ring, and Dad started cutting pills in half." Daniel's expression changed for a fraction of a second. He had not known about the ring. Abby saw the shock before he buried it. "This ranch survived before you came back," he said. "Surviving isn't the same as being safe." Ranger moved between them without touching either person. His presence forced both siblings to step apart. Daniel looked down at the dog, then across the divided pasture. "Stay out of the west section," he said. "At least until I understand where everything stands." Abby stared at him. "You mean until you decide what else we're allowed to know?" Daniel returned to his pickup and drove away without entering the house. Long after sunset, the wind strengthened. Thomas slept on the sofa, and Ruth worked silently on a quilt beneath the weak kitchen light. Abby sat near the cold fireplace, with the North Star questions circling her mind, though she did not yet know the company's name. At 11:36, Ranger's head lifted sharply. A faint metallic strike carried through the darkness from the western pasture. Ranger rose and went to the back door. Abby took a flashlight, clipped on his lead, and followed him outside. The moon was hidden behind clouds. Near the divided fence, a narrow beam of light moved between the survey stakes. Abby switched off her flashlight and crouched behind a water trough. A man in a dark work jacket was driving a steel marker into the ground. He was medium height and lean, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Beside him stood a black pickup, with mud covering the place where a rear license plate should have been. "Private property!" Abby called. The man dropped his mallet and ran. Ranger surged forward. Abby released enough lead for him to clear the trough, then saw the man reach the boundary fence. "Ranger, back!" The dog stopped before crossing the property line. The pickup accelerated down the access road and vanished into the night. Ranger returned carrying a heavy work glove. A silver mountain emblem had been stitched across the wrist. Beneath it were 4 words: North Star Ridge Development. At sunrise, Abby found a white delivery envelope placed against the front door. It was addressed to Thomas Walker. Inside was a formal notice stating that North Star Ridge Development would assume possession of the western pasture in 10 days. Abby read the final paragraph twice. It referred not only to grazing rights but to pledged property, outstanding obligations, and additional collateral listed in attached agreements. Daniel had signed something with North Star. The only question was whether he had risked half the ranch, or all of it. The notice from North Star Ridge Development lay in the center of the Walker kitchen table, like something poisonous no one wanted to touch. Outside, Thursday morning came cold and colorless over Elk Hollow. Frost silvered the porch steps, cattle called from the lower field, and a hard western wind pushed against the farmhouse windows with the first warning of snow. Ruth stood at the counter with both hands wrapped around her chipped blue mug. Thomas sat beneath a wool blanket, his face still pale from the previous day's collapse. Ranger rested near Abby's chair, but his eyes remained fixed on Daniel, who had arrived before breakfast after receiving a single message from his sister. "Come home. Tell us everything." Daniel looked older in the morning light. His beard, once dark brown like Thomas's had been, was threaded heavily with gray. The burn scar along his neck disappeared beneath his flannel collar, but the memory behind it seemed to shape the way he held himself, shoulders forward, as though still leaning into smoke. He read the North Star notice twice before lowering it. "They weren't supposed to move this soon," he said. Abby's voice remained controlled. "Then you knew they were coming?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Eventually." "How much of the ranch did you give them?" "I didn't give them anything. The letter calls the pasture collateral. It wasn't supposed to become theirs." Thomas shifted in his chair. "Daniel." Something in the old man's voice ended the last of his son's resistance. Daniel pulled out a chair but did not sit. He stood behind it with both hands gripping the wooden back, like a man giving testimony before a judge he had spent years avoiding. It started with the fire. 3 years earlier, late August had turned the Bitterroot Valley into tinder. Rain had not fallen for nearly 7 weeks. Grass broke beneath boots, creek beds narrowed to muddy ribbons, and smoke from distant wildfires had blurred the mountains for days. Daniel had believed the Walker Ranch was safe because the largest blaze remained beyond the western ridge. Then the wind changed. A dry front came through shortly after noon, carrying gusts strong enough to bend cottonwoods and tear roofing from an abandoned shed near town. The fire crossed the ridge in less than 2 hours. It moved downhill with a roar Daniel later said sounded like a freight train running beneath the earth. At the time, Thomas had been home from the hospital for only 11 days after a mild stroke. He could speak and walk, but his right hand trembled, and exhaustion came without warning. Ruth remained beside him while Daniel, 2 hired ranch hands, and volunteer firefighters tried to move cattle toward the creek. They saved the farmhouse and main barn. Almost everything west of them burned. Nearly half the grazing land turned black. The hay shed collapsed, taking most of the winter feed with it. Smoke and panic scattered the herd. Some cattle were found miles away. Others never returned. Of the animals recovered, several had burns or lung damage severe enough that the local veterinarian recommended euthanasia. Daniel spoke without looking at anyone. Dad kept saying we'd rebuild. That was what he always said after a hard season. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. The ranch's insurance covered only part of the structural damage. It did not replace the lost grazing season, the dead cattle, or the cost of buying feed at emergency prices. Daniel still had 2 employees to pay, parents to care for, and a herd too small to generate enough income. The Elk Hollow Community Bank refused an additional operating loan. The ranch already carried repair debt, and the wildfire had reduced the value of its productive land. The loan officer, a cautious woman who had known the Walkers for years, apologized but told Daniel the numbers no longer supported the risk. A week later, North Star contacted him. Their representative arrived in a clean black SUV and wore polished boots that had never crossed a muddy calving field. He spoke gently about preserving family land and helping rural communities survive disasters. North Star offered a private loan large enough to replace winter feed, repair fencing, purchase 30 bred cows, and keep the ranch operating through spring. The collateral, Daniel had been told, would include only the 70 acres most heavily damaged by the fire. "I thought 1 healthy calving season would put us ahead," he said. "Maybe 2. The following year brought another drought. Hay prices nearly doubled, the new cows produced fewer calves than expected, and several pregnancies were lost during a late freeze. Daniel made the first payments, but not enough to satisfy North Star's schedule. The company offered an extension. The extension included an administrative fee, a higher interest rate, and a second piece of collateral near the West Creek. Daniel signed because he believed summer grass and higher cattle prices would correct everything. Instead, a respiratory infection moved through the calf pens that winter. It began with coughing and fever, then spread despite isolation and antibiotics. 7 calves died within 12 days. Others lost so much weight they sold for far less than expected. Each failure pushed Daniel toward another extension. Each extension looked manageable when reduced to a monthly number. Hidden inside the longer pages were inspection charges, legal fees, late penalties, and additional land descriptions. "When did you realize they were trapping you?" Abby asked. Daniel finally sat. "The second extension." "And you kept signing?" "I kept thinking the next season would be different." "That isn't an answer. It's the only one I have." His anger had disappeared. What remained was shame. Daniel explained that North Star never demanded the entire ranch at once. They took it one promise at a time. Another 30 days, another deferred payment, another signature to prevent foreclosure. By the time he understood how much land had been attached to the debt, admitting the truth meant admitting that his choices might destroy what 4 generations of Walkers had protected. He also feared what the news would do to Thomas. After the stroke, even small stress caused headaches and confusion. One afternoon, Thomas became disoriented after opening a routine hospital bill. Daniel decided then that he would solve the debt before his father ever had to understand it. Ruth looked stricken. "You should have told me. You were already selling quilts to keep the lights on." "And Abby?" Thomas asked. Daniel glanced toward his sister. "She had just lost someone." Abby knew who he meant. Staff Sergeant Maya Torres had been 36, compact and strong, with close-cropped black hair, a dry sense of humor, and the irritating habit of singing old country songs during equipment checks. She had trained beside Abby for years and had been one of the few people capable of making her laugh after a difficult mission. Maya died during Abby's final overseas deployment, after a vehicle accident on a mountain road. For months afterward, Abby answered family calls with a steady face and then sat alone after the screen went dark. Daniel had heard the emptiness in her voice. "I thought bringing you home to another disaster would break you," he said. "You didn't protect me," Abby replied. You decided what I was allowed to survive." Before Daniel could respond, a second vehicle entered the yard. An aging gray tow truck stopped beside the barn, its door marked with faded lettering, Walker Auto and Repair. Eli Walker climbed down. At 38, Eli was the youngest of the three siblings. He was leaner than Daniel, with untidy light brown hair, a narrow face, and hazel eyes that revealed emotion faster than he could hide it. Grease darkened his work jacket and both hands. A thin scar crossed two knuckles on his left hand, earned years earlier when he punched a concrete wall after discovering that his former business partner had emptied their company account and disappeared. The betrayal nearly cost Eli his garage and left him deeply suspicious of contracts, though not suspicious enough when his own family asked for help. He entered the kitchen, saw the North Star notice, and stopped. "Daniel told you," he said. "Not everything," Abby answered. Eli sat beside the cold stove and rubbed his palms together. 2 years earlier, his business partner had taken customer deposits, failed to pay suppliers, and vanished. Eli faced lawsuits, unpaid taxes, and the loss of the garage he had built from an abandoned service station. Daniel used part of the North Star money to rescue him. "I told him I'd repay every dollar," Eli said. "Did you?" Abby asked. "Some." In return, Daniel asked Eli to witness 2 loan extensions. The pages presented to him had highlighted signature lines and short summaries describing temporary changes to the repayment schedule. "You read the full agreements?" Abby asked. Eli looked at the floor. "No." "You own a business. You knew better." "I did." "Then why sign?" "Because Daniel had just saved my garage. Because Dad was sick. Because I was ashamed, and gratitude can make a man stupid when he wants to call it loyalty." No one spoke. Abby felt anger moving through her, hot and immediate. Yet the 2 men before her did not resemble conspirators. They resembled frightened brothers who had chosen relief over truth so many times that the choices eventually became a road they could no longer leave. Ranger had remained near the doorway throughout the confession. Whenever Daniel shifted, the dog's ears followed him. He did not approach. Daniel stood and walked into the equipment shed. Abby followed several minutes later. She found him sitting on the dusty concrete inside the pale outline where the missing tractor had once stood. His broad shoulders shook, though he made no sound. "I don't know how to save it," he admitted. "I haven't known for a long time." Ranger appeared behind Abby. The German Shepherd watched Daniel, then crossed the shed slowly. He lowered his head onto Daniel's knee. Daniel placed one scarred hand against the dog's neck and finally wept. That evening, Ruth gathered the hospital papers Abby had requested. She spread them across the kitchen table, arranging appointment cards, discharge notes, and medication lists by date. Her finger stopped on one page. "The last extension," she whispered. "What date did you say it was signed?" Daniel told her. Ruth's face lost its color. "Thomas was in the hospital that morning." Thomas frowned. "I signed papers after I came home." "No," Ruth said. "That morning you were sedated for the heart procedure. For 2 days afterward, your hand shook so badly I fed you soup." Abby looked at the North Star notice, then at her father's trembling fingers. If Thomas had barely been conscious and could not hold a spoon, how had his signature appeared on North Star's final agreement? Friday morning opened beneath a ceiling of iron-gray clouds. Overnight, the temperature in Elk Hollow had fallen close to freezing, leaving a brittle skin of ice across the stock tanks and thin white lines along every fence rail. By 8, Abby was driving south toward Missoula with Ranger in the passenger seat and Daniel's folder locked inside an old ammunition box behind her. Thomas had slept poorly after Ruth's discovery about the final loan extension. He remembered signing papers after leaving the hospital, but he could not say which documents they were, how many pages they contained, or whether anyone had explained the changes. The stroke had not erased his intelligence. It had damaged the order in which memories returned, leaving some moments sharp and others hidden behind fog. Laura Bennett's office occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building near the Clark Fork River. There was no polished marble in the lobby and no assistant guarding the door. Only shelves crowded with property maps, court files, and framed photographs of Montana farms. Laura was 50, tall and straight-backed, with short auburn hair touched by gray at the temples and clear green eyes that seemed to grow calmer whenever someone else became angry. She wore a charcoal sweater, dark trousers, and practical boots marked by dried mud. Her slow, deliberate manner was not hesitation. It came from years of learning that desperate people often told the most important truth only after silence stopped frightening them. Laura's parents had once owned a small dairy farm outside Great Falls. When milk prices collapsed, they accepted a refinancing agreement containing penalties they did not fully understand. The lender took the farm 3 years later. Laura had been 19 when she watched her father hand over the keys to the barn where he had worked since childhood. That loss shaped her career and left her with little patience for companies that disguised land acquisition as financial rescue. She read Daniel's contracts without interruption. Ranger lay beneath the window, watching the street while Abby sat across from the attorney's desk. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Laura placed the first document beside the second. "These are not clean agreements," she said. Several later attachments listed new inspection fees, legal charges, and expanded collateral, but the pages were not initialed individually. The signature blocks appeared only at the end, making it difficult to prove that Daniel or Thomas had seen every page. One property description referred vaguely to western acreage without identifying the exact boundary. Another used language broad enough to include structures, water access, and any land connected to the original parcel. "That ambiguity helps Northstar," Laura explained. "Always them to argue that your family agreed to more than you believed." Abby pointed to the extension dated during Thomas's hospital procedure. Laura studied the hospital note Ruth had found, then leaned back. "This date is useful, but not enough by itself. Northstar will say he signed a separate copy after discharge, or that the agreement was prepared on this date and executed later." To seek an emergency injunction, Laura needed the original loan contract, a complete payment record, correspondence showing Thomas objected to the changes, or proof that pages had been substituted. "Do you know where your father kept his records?" she asked. Abby thought of the locked study, but Daniel had already admitted that Northstar's representative once visited the house while Thomas was recovering. If the room had been entered, anything left there might already be missing. Laura closed the folder. "Then ask your father where he would hide something from a man who knew where his desk was." When Abby returned to the ranch shortly after noon, Thomas was sitting near the kitchen window, with Ranger's old leather tracking lead coiled across his knees. The object had been stored in a hallway closet for years, yet he had taken it out without explanation. Ruth was baking bread, but her movements were distracted. Daniel had driven to the feed supplier to delay another overdue payment, while Eli remained at his garage. Abby placed a copy of the original property map on the table and asked Thomas whether he had kept any documents outside the study. For a long time he stared at the western pasture. "I knew something was wrong after the second extension," he finally said. "The numbers Daniel gave me did not match the notices." He had begun recording payments by hand because he no longer trusted the company's statements. He also remembered writing 2 letters disputing fees and asking Northstar to identify the exact land being used as collateral. When Abby asked where those records were, Thomas rubbed his trembling right hand. "Somewhere the rain couldn't touch them," he said. "Somewhere the mice couldn't eat them." Ruth suggested the attic, the root cellar, and the tool shed. Thomas shook his head at each answer. Then his eyes moved toward the distant slope where an abandoned sheep barn stood beyond the lower pasture. "I went there," he murmured. "I think I went there." The barn had not housed animals since Abby was a teenager. Its stone foundation remained solid, but the roof sagged, and one wall leaned toward the creek. Abby wanted to search immediately, yet Thomas insisted he needed time to remember exactly where he had hidden the papers. Rain began before 2, cold and steady, turning the yard dark within minutes. Abby drove into town to collect Thomas's renewed prescription and purchase waterproof tarps for the broken barn roof. Before leaving, she told him to remain inside. Thomas gave her the offended look of a lifelong rancher being instructed not to walk across his own land. Ruth promised to watch him. By the time Abby returned, the rain had become a slanting curtain across the headlights. Dusk had arrived early, swallowing the fields beneath low clouds. Ruth met her on the porch without an umbrella. Her silver braid was wet, and fear had erased the patience from her face. Thomas was gone. His cane was missing from beside the sofa, along with his brown canvas coat. Ruth had assumed he was checking the calf pen. When she finally searched outside, she found the gate open and a line of uneven boot prints already dissolving in the rain. Abby felt the old discipline of training settle over her panic. She did not shout Thomas's name into the wind or run blindly toward the pasture. She took a flannel shirt from his bedroom, held it beneath Ranger's nose, and gave the command the dog had followed in forests, cities, and mountain roads. Find him. Ranger inhaled deeply, circled once in the kitchen, then pulled toward the back door. His rear hip was stiff in the cold, but the moment the scent became clear, age seemed to fall away from him. He crossed the yard with his nose low, followed the disappearing prints to the lower gate, and turned west. Abby kept the long lead loose enough for him to choose the path. The scent led past the empty cattle pens, through soaked grass, and down a shallow slope where runoff had begun filling the hoof tracks. Twice Ranger stopped, testing the wind. Each time he corrected left, away from the obvious trail, following what Thomas's boots had left on crushed sage and wet fence wire. The sheep barn emerged through the rain like the remains of a stranded ship. Its doors hung open, banging against the frame. Ranger pulled inside, then barked sharply near the rear wall. Thomas lay behind an overturned feeding trough. His cane was trapped beneath one leg, and his left ankle had swollen inside his boot. He was conscious but confused, shivering so violently that his words broke apart. "I knew it was here," he said. "Had to find it before they did." Abby checked his breathing and pulse, then wrapped him in her jacket and an emergency blanket from Ranger's field kit. His skin was cold, and his lips had begun losing color. She called Eli, knowing his tow truck could handle the muddy service road better than an ambulance without four-wheel drive. Eli answered on the first ring and promised to come immediately. While they waited, Ranger paced the barn. He returned repeatedly to a section of floor near the old grain bin, scratching at one warped board. Abby ordered him back, but he whined and pawed the same spot again. The board showed fresh marks along one edge, as though it had once been lifted and replaced. Using Thomas's cane as leverage, Abby pried it loose. Below the floor rested a rectangular metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Thomas watched from beneath the blanket. "Rain couldn't reach it," he whispered, "and neither could the mice." The box contained the original North Star loan agreement, Thomas's handwritten ledger, copies of every payment receipt he had collected, and 2 letters sent by certified mail questioning unexpected fees. Beneath them lay hospital records and appointment cards Ruth had stored with the papers. Abby compared the original contract to the copy North Star had used in its notice. The first agreement named only 70 acres of burned western land as collateral. The later version described the entire Walker property, 420 acres, including the farmhouse, creek access, barns, and mineral rights. One attachment carried Thomas's signature beneath a date, matching the morning of his heart procedure. According to the hospital schedule, he had been under sedation at that exact time. Eli arrived 20 minutes later, pale and breathless, his work jacket open despite the rain. Together, he and Abby moved Thomas into the heated cab, while Ranger climbed beside him. Thomas rested one hand against the dog's wet head throughout the drive home. Laura came to the ranch that night after Abby called. She examined the papers beneath the kitchen light, while Ruth warmed Thomas beside the stove. The evidence was stronger than anything Daniel had kept. It suggested substituted pages, disputed fees, and an impossible signing date. But Laura did not celebrate. "North Star will argue that Thomas signed another complete agreement after leaving the hospital," she said. "They'll claim this version was only a draft, or that the date reflects preparation rather than execution." Abby looked at the property description covering all 420 acres. What would prove they changed it deliberately? Laura closed the metal box. Someone who saw the documents being altered. Or evidence that North Star planned to take the entire ranch before your family officially defaulted. Outside, Ranger stood at the window, staring through the rain toward the western fence. Somewhere beyond it was the person who might know the truth. But who could prove North Star had been preparing to seize the Walker Ranch long before the debt came due? Saturday morning came bright but bitterly cold over Elk Hollow. The rain had passed, leaving the mountains white along their upper ridges, and every roadside puddle sealed beneath a thin sheet of ice. Inside the Walker kitchen, Laura Bennett spread the recovered documents across the table, while Abby watched Ranger sleep beside Thomas's chair. The German shepherd's paws twitched occasionally, as if he were still following the old rancher through the storm. Thomas's injured ankle had been wrapped, and Ruth had forbidden him from leaving the house without supervision, a command he accepted with the wounded dignity of a king temporarily removed from his horse. The metal box from the sheep barn had strengthened their case, but Laura remained cautious. North Star could claim the original agreement had later been replaced with a properly signed version. The impossible hospital date suggested fraud, yet suspicion alone would not stop the company from taking possession. They needed proof that North Star had planned to seize the entire ranch before the Walker family officially failed to make its payments. Abby placed the work glove Ranger had recovered beside the documents. Its silver mountain emblem matched the North Star logo, but there was no name, identification number, or fingerprint that could reliably connect it to the man who had entered the pasture. "Then we find the owner," Abby said. Laura studied her. Ranger's reaction might point us toward someone, but a dog recognizing a scent is not enough for court. Abby nodded. He doesn't have to testify. He only has to tell me where to look. North Star had opened a temporary office in a converted insurance building near the southern edge of town. The structure was narrow and newly painted, with tinted windows, a polished sign, and 2 black SUVs parked outside. It looked strangely clean among Elk Hollow's feed stores, weathered garages, and mud-streaked pickups. Abby parked across the street beside a closed hardware shop. Ranger sat in the passenger seat with the window lowered several inches. She did not release him or give a tracking command. She only placed the recovered glove inside a paper bag on the dashboard and waited. Several employees entered and left during the next hour. Ranger watched them without interest. Shortly before noon, a side door opened, and a lean man stepped outside carrying a rolled survey map beneath one arm. Gavin Price was 36, narrow-shouldered and slightly stooped, with sandy hair cut unevenly above his ears, and a hard, sunken face that made him look older than he was. His brown jacket was too thin for the weather, and anxiety had carved permanent lines between his eyebrows. He moved like a man who expected someone to call his name for the wrong reason. On his right hand, he wore a dark work glove bearing the silver North Star mountain. His left hand was bare. Ranger's head lifted instantly. His nostrils widened. He leaned toward the open window, eyes fixed on Gavin's gloved hand, then released a low breath Abby recognized from years of scent work. The reaction was focused, not aggressive. Ranger had found a familiar odor. Abby stepped from the pickup holding the paper bag. Gavin saw the matching glove through the clear plastic and stopped. For 1 second, recognition crossed his face. Then fear replaced it. He turned, hurried to an older black pickup parked behind the office, and drove away before Abby could reach the street. Ranger remained in the cab because she had ordered him to stay. He watched the truck disappear, then looked back at Abby as though his part of the problem had been completed. She photographed the vehicle before it turned the corner. Mud covered the rear plate, but a bent left bumper and a white contractor number remained visible along the door. Ranger's identification could not prove Gavin had trespassed, yet it gave Abby a name and a vehicle. When she showed the photograph to Eli, he recognized the truck immediately. Gavin had brought it to Walker Auto and Repair 6 months earlier for a damaged fuel line. Eli remembered him because the man insisted on paying in cash and repeatedly asked whether the road behind the western pasture remained passable during winter. At the time, Eli had assumed Northstar was inspecting the land already listed as collateral. Now the question sounded different. The garage's security system was old, consisting of 2 cameras Eli had installed after his former partner disappeared with customer money. One camera faced the service bays, the other recorded the parking lot and state highway. Eli searched through archive footage stored on an external drive. After nearly 2 hours, he found Gavin's truck pulling into the garage on April 14, 6 months before Northstar claimed the Walker loan had entered final default. The recording showed another vehicle arriving 20 minutes later. A tall man stepped from a black SUV and spoke to Gavin beside the truck. Eli paused the image. That's Victor Hale. Victor was 54, the regional director of Northstar Ridge Development. He was tall and carefully groomed, with silver hair, a clean-shaven face, and the composed expression of someone who rarely needed to raise his voice. Victor had built his career acquiring distressed agricultural land across Montana and Wyoming. He presented himself as a patient businessman who offered solutions when banks would not, but local ranchers described him as a man who could smile while measuring the curtains in a house that still belonged to someone else. In the footage, Victor unfolded a property map across Gavin's hood. He pointed toward a route that matched the Western Access Road, then traced a line extending far beyond the 70 burned acres named in the original agreement. The camera had no useful audio, but the timing mattered. Northstar had been discussing access to the larger property months before the final payment deadline. Laura considered the recording important but incomplete. The image established contact and planning, not necessarily criminal intent. They needed something showing what Gavin had actually surveyed. Eli remembered that the western boundary touched the ranch of Henry Doyle, a 66-year-old cattleman whose land had remained in his family since the 1940s. Henry was short and thick through the chest, with a weather-reddened face, a gray beard trimmed close to his jaw, and an old injury that caused him to drag his right foot slightly. He spoke bluntly and disliked corporations, lawyers, and young people who drove trucks too clean for honest work. Years earlier, a mining company had poisoned one of his stock ponds and avoided responsibility through a technicality. Since then, Henry kept motion-sensitive trail cameras around his fences, less for wildlife than for human beings carrying clipboards. Henry invited Abby and Laura into his mudroom, but refused to let Ranger enter until the dog inspected him first. Ranger sniffed the rancher's boots, accepted a scratch beneath the chin, and immediately lay beside the door. Henry approved. "Better manners than most surveyors," he said. He searched his trail camera archive and found 3 recordings from the summer. The first showed Gavin crossing near the Walker fence in June. The second showed him driving stakes along the creek road in July. The third, captured in August, showed Gavin marking a wide route from the county road toward the farmhouse, barn, and equipment yard. In one frame, he held a map bearing several shaded sections. The markings covered nearly the entire Walker Ranch. At that time, Daniel had been receiving reassuring messages from Northstar promising another extension. Gavin called Abby shortly after sunset. His voice was barely above a whisper. He instructed her to come alone to the Bitterroot Lantern, a roadside diner 6 miles north of town. The diner was nearly empty when Abby arrived, though Ranger remained in the truck where he could see the entrance. Gavin sat in the rear booth wearing a baseball cap and holding a coffee he never drank. Without the survey jacket and glove, he looked less like an intruder and more like a frightened employee who had spent too long pretending he did not understand his work. He admitted that Northstar targeted farms owned by elderly people, families recovering from disasters, and ranchers already rejected by traditional banks. The first loans were designed to appear generous. Later extensions used confusing attachments to expand collateral, while borrowers focused on lower monthly payments. Victor called it land recovery strategy. Surveyors like Gavin were ordered to map access roads, water rights, structures, and development potential before the borrowers reached formal default. The Walker Ranch was especially valuable because the creek, road access, and foothill views made it suitable for expensive vacation properties. "Why were you in the pasture at night?" Abby asked. Victor didn't want the family asking questions before the transition date. "You knew those markers covered land outside the original agreement." Gavin lowered his eyes. "I knew." "Then why stay?" His mouth tightened. He had a 9-year-old son living with his former wife in Helena. 2 years earlier, medical bills from the boy's emergency surgery had left Gavin deeply in debt. North Star paid well and provided insurance. Each time he considered leaving, he remembered the hospital invoices. "I told myself I only measured land," he said. "I didn't write the contracts." Abby did not absolve him. She simply recognized the same excuse that had trapped Daniel and Eli, the belief that responsibility belonged to someone farther up the chain. Gavin said North Star's internal emails would prove Victor ordered the full survey before the Walkers defaulted. Some messages also referred to Thomas's age and medical condition as reasons the acquisition would face limited resistance. Gavin could copy the files, but he needed access to the office server on Monday morning. He asked for 1 day. After that, he would give the emails to Laura and sign a statement. "Do not contact me at work," he warned. "Victor checks company phones." Before leaving, Gavin looked through the diner window at Ranger. "That dog knew me." "He remembered what you carried into his home," Abby said. Gavin nodded as if that answer hurt more than an accusation. At 8 the following morning, Abby called the private number Gavin had written on a napkin. The call went directly to voicemail. At 9, the number had been disconnected. By 10, Laura had obtained the address of his apartment. Abby and Eli drove there and found the door unlocked. The rooms were nearly empty. Several shirts remained in a closet, but the computer was gone, along with photographs, toiletries, and the small plastic bin Gavin had said contained his son's medical records. There were no signs of a struggle. Yet he had clearly left in haste. An unfinished cup of coffee stood beside the sink, and a North Star identification card lay broken in 2 on the floor. When Abby returned to the ranch, a courier was waiting on the porch. He handed Thomas a revised possession notice from North Star. The company had moved its takeover forward by 2 days. Instead of waiting until the following week, its crews would arrive Monday morning, less than 24 hours away. Abby looked toward the western pasture, where the orange survey ribbon snapped violently in the wind. Somewhere, Gavin Price was carrying the evidence that might save the Walker Ranch. But had he run because fear finally defeated his conscience, or had North Star discovered that he intended to speak? Before sunrise on Monday, the sound of diesel engines rolled through the western valley like distant thunder. Abby was already awake. She had spent most of the night at the kitchen table with Laura's notes, the original loan agreement, and the trail camera photographs spread before her, hoping Gavin Price would call. He never did. At 5:18, Ranger rose from beside Thomas's chair and moved toward the window. His ears turned forward, his body becoming still before the headlights appeared along the county road. 2 bulldozers climbed toward the ranch in low gear, followed by 3 white equipment trucks and a black SUV. Their yellow warning lights swept across the fences, the farmhouse, and the orange survey ribbons snapping in the pre-dawn wind. Ruth came from the hallway in her robe, clutching the chipped blue mug even though it held no coffee. Thomas pushed himself upright with his cane. Daniel arrived from the bunkhouse, where he had slept after repairing a broken water line, while Eli's tow truck raced through the main gate moments later. No one needed to ask why North Star had come. The machine stopped beside the western entrance, filling the air with exhaust and the metallic groan of hydraulic systems. Ranger stood close to Abby's left leg, his gaze fixed on the crews but his body under control. Victor Hale stepped from the black SUV as though arriving for a scheduled business meeting rather than the seizure of a family's land. At 54, he was tall and lean, with carefully combed silver hair, a clean-shaven face, and pale blue eyes that rarely revealed impatience. His charcoal overcoat was too expensive for a muddy pasture, and polished brown boots made him seem almost untouched by the cold landscape around him. Victor had spent 25 years acquiring distressed properties across the rural West. He did not shout, threaten, or insult people. He preferred documents, deadlines, and the quiet certainty that exhausted families would eventually surrender rather than continue fighting. Behind him, 6 contract workers climbed from the trucks. Most looked uncomfortable. They were ordinary men, hired to remove fencing and prepare access roads, not North Star executives. One of them, a heavy-set operator in his 40s named Curtis Bell, kept looking toward the farmhouse as though wishing someone would tell him the job had been canceled. Victor opened a leather folder. "Good morning, Mr. Walker. Under the revised possession notice delivered yesterday, North Star Ridge Development is authorized to secure the western parcel beginning today." Thomas walked to the gate despite Abby's warning to remain near the porch. His ankle was still wrapped beneath his boot, and the cold made his hands tremble, but he stood as straight as his damaged body allowed. "You are not authorized to touch this ranch." Victor's expression remained polite. "The documents say otherwise." Daniel stepped forward, then stopped. For several seconds, he watched the machines idling where he had once waited for the school bus with Abby and Eli. His face seemed to collapse beneath the weight of everything he had hidden. "Before anyone does anything," he said, "there's something my parents deserve to hear from me." Ruth looked at him, already knowing the confession would hurt. Daniel admitted that he had signed more extensions than he had previously revealed. He had hidden 3 formal notices, sold the equipment without telling Thomas, and allowed North Star to survey the land because Victor promised another delay. When Ruth asked about the short messages sent to Abby, Daniel lowered his head. He had used her phone while she slept, writing the cold, simple sentences because he feared Abby would recognize his own number and return immediately. "I told myself I was buying time," he said. "But all I did was decide which truth each of you was allowed to know." Eli moved beside his brother. His grease-stained jacket had been pulled over yesterday's clothes, and fear showed openly across his narrow face. "I knew the second extension included more land than Daniel said," he confessed. "I didn't know it was everything, but I knew enough to ask questions. I didn't ask because I was afraid North Star would call in the money that saved my garage." Ruth's eyes filled, but she said nothing. Abby expected Thomas to explode. The ranch had been his inheritance, his work, and the proof of every promise he had made to his own father. Instead, the old man looked at his sons with grief rather than anger. "You made bad choices," he said quietly. "But the worst choice was believing one man should carry the whole storm alone. A burden hidden in one pair of hands doesn't become lighter. It only becomes harder for the rest of the family to see before it falls." Daniel began to apologize, but Thomas raised one trembling hand. "An apology is where truth begins. It is not where responsibility ends." Victor waited until the family's silence settled. "This is unfortunate," he said, "but private disagreements do not alter contractual obligations." He turned toward Curtis. "Remove the western fence and open the equipment access." Curtis hesitated. "Sir, there are people standing in the work zone. Then give them time to move." 2 workers carried bolt cutters toward the gate. Thomas stepped directly into their path. "This fence was built by my father." Victor glanced at his watch. "Mr. Walker, I strongly recommend that you step aside. I strongly recommend that you leave." The exchange drew everyone's attention toward the gate. No one noticed that one of the equipment trucks had been left on the sloping access road with its engine running. Its driver, a young contractor checking a loose chain behind the cab, had failed to engage the parking brake completely. The truck began rolling backward, slowly at first, its rear tires crushing wet gravel. Curtis shouted. Thomas turned, but his injured ankle delayed him. The vehicle was already descending toward him. Ranger moved before Abby could call his name. The German shepherd crossed the distance in 3 powerful strides, caught the sleeve of Thomas's canvas coat between his teeth, and pulled backward with his full weight. Thomas lost his balance and fell into the grass. The truck rolled through the exact place where he had been standing, missing his boots by less than a foot before Curtis climbed onto the running board and reached through the open door to force the brake. Ranger released Thomas's sleeve immediately. He positioned himself between the old rancher and the truck, barking with a force Abby had not heard since their final year of service. Yet he did not lunge at the driver or bite anyone. His warning was controlled, aimed entirely at keeping the danger away. Abby dropped beside her father and checked his head, neck, and injured ankle. Thomas was shaken but conscious. His coat sleeve carried 4 shallow punctures from Ranger's teeth, but there was no blood beneath the fabric. "Good dog," Thomas whispered, pressing one hand against Ranger's shoulder. The dog stopped barking only when Abby gave the command. The near accident changed the worker's mood. Curtis shut down the truck and told Victor he would not move another machine while the family remained in the area. Victor's politeness thinned. "Your employment is with the contractor, Mr. Bell, not with this family. My employment doesn't require me to run over an old man." Victor reached for his phone. Abby rose, keeping her hands visible. Daniel and Eli stepped beside her. None of them carried weapons. None threatened the workers. Ruth helped Thomas stand behind them, while Ranger remained at the old man's side. "You can call whoever you need to call," Abby said, "but those machines will have to pass this family before they touch the land." Victor looked from Abby to her brothers. "Are you obstructing a lawful property transfer?" "We are waiting for a court to decide whether it is lawful. There is no order preventing us from proceeding." He began dialing the sheriff's office. A cruiser appeared at the end of the road before the call connected. Behind it came Laura Bennett's Mud Street sedan. Sheriff Nathan Cole stepped from the cruiser carrying a sealed envelope. Nathan was 58, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair, a weathered face, and the calm movements of a man who had spent 3 decades separating frightened people before fear turned into violence. He had grown up 2 valleys away and had known the Walker family since Daniel was a boy. Nathan believed the law worked best when it protected dignity as carefully as property, though he never allowed friendship to replace procedure. "No one moves a machine," he said. Laura walked beside him, her auburn hair disordered by the wind, and her green eyes sharper than Abby had yet seen them. She held up a signed court order. "Emergency injunction. All possession, clearing, surveying, and transfer activity is suspended for 30 days pending review of altered collateral descriptions, disputed signatures, and Thomas Walker's medical capacity at the time of execution." Victor read the first page without changing expression. Only the tightening of his jaw betrayed him. "This order was obtained using incomplete and misleading information." Laura answered, "Then you will have 30 days to explain the complete information to a judge." Victor turned toward Nathan. "The Walkers have accepted funds, concealed their own defaults, and now claim victimhood because repayment has become inconvenient." Nathan remained neutral. "Today's order is clear. Your crews leave." One by one, the bulldozer engines shut down. The sudden silence spread across the pasture, larger than the noise had been. Victor placed the papers back into Laura's hand. "North Star will file a counterclaim for loan fraud, interference with contractual rights, and every dollar this delay costs us. Your clients may discover that keeping the land is more expensive than losing it." He entered the SUV without another word. The workers reversed down the access road, Curtis giving Thomas a brief apologetic nod before following them. No one celebrated. 30 days was not a victory. It was borrowed time. That afternoon, Laura returned to her Missoula office to begin preparing for North Star's response. At 4:40, a plain brown envelope appeared beneath her door. It carried no return address and no postage mark, suggesting someone had delivered it by hand. Inside was a small black flash drive wrapped in a page torn from a survey notebook. Written across the paper were 5 words. "They planned it from the beginning." Laura inserted the drive into an isolated computer. More than 400 internal North Star emails appeared on the screen. Several carried Victor Hale's name. Others included survey maps, medical references to Thomas, and messages discussing how quickly the Walker family might surrender once the machinery arrived. Gavin Price had vanished, but he had left the truth behind. The question was whether one frightened surveyor's stolen emails could defeat a corporation with enough lawyers to bury the Walker family beneath its own rescue. Winter settled over Elk Hollow with deep snow, frozen water lines, and mornings so cold that breath hung beneath the barn roof like smoke. The emergency injunction had stopped North Star's machines, but it had not filled the feed bins, repaired the failing tractor, or erased the legitimate portion of the Walker debt. For 6 months, the family prepared for court while struggling to keep the ranch alive. Laura Bennett spent long evenings organizing the internal emails Gavin had delivered, matching dates to surveys, hospital records, and altered attachments. North Star answered with motions, accusations, and legal bills designed to exhaust everyone before a judge could hear the truth. Abby understood the strategy. Victor Hale did not need to prove the company innocent if he could make resistance too expensive to continue. Abby used part of her military separation pay to replace the broken furnace, purchase Thomas's medication, and cover emergency hay through January. When Daniel suggested using the rest to settle the debt, she refused. "That would only replace your secret rescue with mine," she said. "This family cannot survive by waiting for one person to save everyone else." The words hurt Daniel, but he understood them. He sold his newer pickup, bought an older truck with rust around the wheel wells, and placed the difference into the ranch account. Every morning before sunrise, he recorded feed costs, veterinary bills, fuel purchases, and cattle sales in a ledger left openly on the kitchen table. No payment was made without Ruth, Thomas, Abby, and Eli seeing it. Daniel had once hidden numbers to protect the family. Now he used numbers to rebuild their trust. Eli began arriving after closing his garage each evening. He repaired the utility tractor with salvaged parts, rebuilt a damaged feed auger, and welded cracks in the cattle panels without charging the ranch. To repay the money Daniel had used to save his business, he accepted overnight towing jobs along the interstate and spent several freezing nights pulling stranded vehicles from mountain roads. Fatigue hollowed his cheeks, but he no longer disguised it with jokes. When Abby warned him that exhaustion could become another form of punishment, Eli admitted that he was still learning the difference between taking responsibility and trying to suffer enough to erase guilt. Thomas faced the same lesson from the opposite direction. His ankle healed slowly, and his heart medication restored some strength, but winter revealed how much age and illness had taken from him. Each morning he walked a measured route from the porch to the lower barn, with Ranger beside him. The German Shepherd never pulled ahead. When Thomas's breathing changed, or pain stiffened his hip, Ranger stopped, sat, and waited. At first, Thomas complained that the dog treated him like fragile cargo. One morning, he tried to continue after Ranger stopped. His legs weakened 20 yards later, forcing him to grip a fence post until Abby reached him. After that, Thomas began respecting Ranger's judgment. "He's an irritating creature," he told Ruth. "Always right at the most inconvenient moment." Ruth smiled. "That may be why he likes you." By March, Thomas could walk to the creek and back. Accepting Ranger's watchfulness did not make him feel smaller. It allowed him to travel farther than pride had permitted. The first person outside the family to join those walks was Sophie Grant, an 11-year-old girl from the neighboring property. Sophie was small for her age, with a cloud of curly red hair, freckled cheeks, and bright gray eyes that rarely rested on one subject for long. She loved animals with the absolute devotion children sometimes offered before the world taught them caution. Her mother had died from illness when Sophie was 7, leaving her and her father alone on their modest horse farm. Sophie began visiting after hearing that Ranger had saved Thomas from a rolling truck. She brought the dog homemade biscuits that were too hard for human teeth but perfect for a German Shepherd. Ranger accepted them solemnly, as though reviewing military rations. Sophie's father, Caleb Grant, usually waited inside his pickup. Caleb was 41, broad-shouldered but noticeably underweight, with dark blonde hair kept too long, and a beard he often forgot to trim. A former Army combat engineer, he had returned from Afghanistan with injuries no X-ray could display. Sudden noises made him flinch, crowded rooms left him breathless, and some weeks he barely crossed his own porch. He had been receiving treatment for post-traumatic stress, but grief and shame had convinced him that withdrawing from others protected them from his worst days. At first, Caleb drove Sophie to the Walker Ranch and remained behind the steering wheel. Ranger changed that gradually. One afternoon, Sophie asked Abby to help repair a loose board near the training pen. Caleb watched them struggle with a warped post, then climbed out and silently took the hammer. He worked for 20 minutes before returning to his truck. The next week he stayed for an hour. By April, he was repairing fences beside Daniel and drinking coffee with Thomas beneath the cottonwood tree. Abby never pushed him to discuss war. She spoke instead about sleepless nights, the confusion of returning home, and the strange guilt of surviving when others had not. Ranger often lay between them, asking nothing. Other people followed. 2 retired Marines came to replace barn shingles. Henry Doyle brought extra seed. Members of Ruth's church delivered soup, quilts, and donated hay. The ranch was still in danger, yet it began to feel less isolated. People arrived to work, but many stayed because honest labor gave them permission to speak without being stared at. The court hearing began in late April at the county courthouse in Missoula. Judge Eleanor Whitcomb presided. She was 62, with short white hair, narrow glasses, and a quiet voice that forced every attorney in the room to listen carefully. Raised on a wheat farm near Havre, she understood both the desperation of rural debt and the danger of excusing careless signatures simply because the consequences were painful. North Star's attorneys argued that Daniel knowingly accepted repeated extensions and that the company had every right to protect its investment. Laura agreed that the original debt was valid. Her case focused instead on the expanded collateral, Thomas's disputed signature, and emails revealing that North Star had planned to acquire the entire property months before default. On the third day, Gavin Price entered the courtroom. He looked thinner than before, with hollow cheeks, an uneven beard, and a suit borrowed from someone broader than he was. He had hidden at his older sister's house outside Helena after Victor threatened to destroy his surveying license, sue him for violating confidentiality, and report him for stealing company files. Gavin admitted that fear had almost kept him away. Then he saw a photograph of the Walker bulldozers in a local newspaper and understood that silence would make him part of whatever happened next. Under oath, he testified that Victor had ordered surveyors to map the farmhouse, barns, creek, and access roads before the Walkers missed their final payment. He described meetings in which elderly owners, wildfire victims, and families rejected by local banks were labeled low-resistance acquisitions. He also identified an email directing staff to replace the original 70-acre property description with language broad enough to cover all 420 acres. North Star's attorney attacked Gavin's credibility, calling him a disgruntled employee and a thief. Gavin's hands trembled, but his answer remained steady. "I stole copies of emails," he said. "North Star tried to steal homes." Judge Whitcomb ruled that the later attachments expanding the collateral were invalid. The evidence showed inadequate disclosure, contradictory property descriptions, and serious doubts regarding Thomas's ability to sign the final extension. She referred North Star's conduct to state and federal investigators for possible deceptive lending practices. Victor remained expressionless as the ruling was read, though the confidence that had once surrounded him seemed to shrink beneath the courtroom lights. Ruth covered her mouth. Daniel lowered his head and wept. Abby reached for his hand. The Walker Ranch would not be taken under the altered agreements. Then Judge Whitcomb delivered the part no one wanted to hear. The original loan had been real. North Star had provided money that purchased feed, repaired fences, replaced cattle, and helped save Eli's garage. Invalidating the fraudulent additions did not erase the legitimate principal. The Walkers still owed that amount, along with a reduced and court-supervised interest calculation. That evening, Laura returned to the ranch with a folder of financial projections. The family gathered around the same kitchen table where North Star's first notice had once lain. Laura showed them the cattle numbers, expected feed costs, equipment repairs, and repayment schedule. Even with every unnecessary expense removed, the ranch was losing money. The herd had not recovered from the fire and disease. Another poor winter would finish what North Star had begun. "You kept the land," Laura said gently. "But unless the ranch changes how it earns money, you may still be bankrupt within 12 months. Outside, Sophie laughed as Ranger carried one of her gloves across the yard, refusing to return it until Caleb followed. Through the window, Abby saw her father walking beside the old dog, Daniel repairing a gate, Eli unloading salvaged lumber, and neighbors working on land they did not own. The court had saved the Walker Ranch from being stolen. Now the family had 1 year to save it from dying. The first warm week of May brought green back to Elk Hollow. But the Walker Ranch still carried winter inside its accounts. The cattle were thin, the western pasture needed reseeding, and Laura's financial projections remained on the kitchen table beneath a stone so no one could pretend the numbers had changed. Abby spent 3 mornings walking the property with Ranger, examining empty stalls, unused barns, damaged grass, and fences that required more money than the ranch possessed. By the 4th morning, she understood that saving the land would require more than working harder. The Walkers had already worked until their bodies, money, and trust nearly failed. They needed to work differently. At Sunday dinner, Abby placed a plan beside Thomas's plate. She proposed selling a small portion of the cattle before summer feed prices increased, dividing the remaining pasture into rotating sections and allowing damaged ground time to recover. The empty horse barn could be converted into simple lodging for veterans and handlers traveling with retired service dogs. The ranch would not call itself a clinic or promise medical treatment. It would offer useful work, routine, companionship, and quiet. Repairing fences, grooming horses, planting vegetables, walking dogs, and sharing meals without requiring anyone to explain every wound they carried. Thomas read the pages twice. At 74, he still measured good ranching by the rules his father had taught him. Keep cattle on grass, repair what breaks, never sell land, and distrust any idea that required a brochure. "A ranch is not a campground," he said. "My father raised cattle here." Daniel closed the family's new financial ledger. Months of honest work had eased some of the exhaustion from his face, though gray still threaded his beard. Granddad replaced horses with tractors when the ranch needed to change. "You told me he called that survival." "He complained about that tractor for 11 years, Thomas replied, "and used it every day," Ruth said. Even Thomas laughed. It did not mean agreement, but it opened the door. The family voted to test Abby's plan for 1 year. Every expense, payment, and mistake would be discussed openly at the kitchen table. They sold 12 cattle rather than the entire breeding herd. Daniel divided the grazing land into smaller paddocks using portable fencing and carefully recorded how long each section rested. Henry Doyle lent them a seed drill, while Caleb Grant helped repair the old horse barn. Caleb no longer remained inside his truck when Sophie visited. At 41, he still moved cautiously around sudden noises and unfamiliar people, but outdoor work gave his hands a purpose when his thoughts became too loud. Sophie, now 12, and still crowned with unruly red curls, appointed herself Ranger's assistant. Her duties consisted mainly of carrying water, brushing his coat, and telling visitors stories in which the aging German shepherd became slightly larger and more heroic with every retelling. She and Caleb became the first participants in the ranch's trial program. They came 3 afternoons each week, repaired fences, cared for the 2 older horses, and ate supper with the Walkers. Caleb never called those visits therapy. He called them useful days. Abby respected the difference. Word reached a regional veterans organization. Its coordinator, Marcus Reed, visited in June. Marcus was 56, a retired Navy corpsman with a square build, dark skin, closely cropped gray hair, and a gentle voice that frightened dogs often trusted before people did. After losing a close friend to suicide, he had spent years helping isolated veterans find practical community without treating them like broken projects. Marcus inspected the barn, asked difficult questions about safety and insurance, and warned Abby not to promise results the ranch could not provide. Then he sent 3 veterans for a weekend work program. One arrived with Beacon, an 11-year-old retired yellow Labrador with cloudy eyes, a thick waist, and the patient expression of a tired schoolteacher. Beacon had once searched public transportation sites for explosives. In retirement, he preferred sunny porches and unattended food. Ranger greeted him with a long inspection before leading him toward the shade of the cottonwood tree. By afternoon, the 2 old working dogs slept side by side, while their former handlers repaired a corral in comfortable silence. The ranch changed slowly rather than miraculously. Ruth organized communal lunches from the farmhouse kitchen, using vegetables from the garden Sophie helped restore. She returned to quilting, but she no longer cut apart family keepsakes. Church members donated fabric, and Ruth sold the finished blankets at fairs to support meals for visiting veterans and retired service dogs. Eli opened a Saturday repair class inside the equipment shed. He taught local teenagers to sharpen blades, patch tires, replace belts, and recognize when a machine had become unsafe. Students paid a small fee when they could. Those without money spent an extra hour repairing ranch equipment. Teaching forced Eli to slow down and explain every decision, the habit he had abandoned when he signed North Star's papers without reading them. Daniel continued managing the herd, but never alone. The family reviewed the accounts together each month. He arranged grazing partnerships with 2 smaller landowners who had unused grass but too few cattle. The Walkers managed the animals and shared the proceeds. Rotational grazing reduced feed costs, while lodging fees, repair classes, quilt sales, and weekend programs created several modest sources of income instead of one fragile source. The first year remained difficult. A water pump failed in August. One guest left after a single night because the open fields made him feel exposed. Beacon stole an entire loaf of Ruth's bread and then pretended to be asleep, causing Thomas to announce that military discipline had clearly declined. Yet the bills were paid. By the second autumn, the ranch made its first full-court supervised loan payment without selling land. The following year brought more visiting groups, stronger pastures, and enough income to increase the payments. Eventually, the legitimate balance was cleared. The family kept every acre. As the ranch's purpose grew, Ranger's world became smaller. Silver spread across his muzzle, and cold mornings stiffened his rear hip. He no longer searched storm-darkened fields or guarded dangerous roads. Most days, he walked beside Thomas from the porch to the creek, stopping whenever the old man's breathing changed. On warm afternoons, he rested beneath the cottonwood while veterans talked nearby. Some spoke about war. Others discussed children, marriages, engines, fishing, or nothing important at all. Ranger listened without judgment, which was often more useful than advice. One December Sunday, snow covered the repaired fences and softened the barn roofs beneath a dark blue evening sky. The farmhouse windows glowed with warmth. At exactly 7, the clock in the living room chimed. Abby reached automatically toward the phone on the side table. For 14 years, 7 o'clock on Sunday had meant finding a signal, arranging her face, and calling home from somewhere far away. But Ruth stood in the kitchen holding the chipped blue mug. Thomas sat near the stove, with Ranger's head resting across his boots. Daniel and Eli were arguing over which of them had rebuilt the front step crooked, though both were laughing too hard to defend themselves. Sophie filled a jar labeled Ranger's Emergency Supplies with dog biscuits, while Caleb hung wet coats beside the door. Abby left the phone where it was. She walked to the table and sat between her brothers. Ruth served soup. Thomas broke the bread. Ranger closed his eyes beneath the old man's hand. The Sunday promise had not ended. It had completed its final duty by bringing Abby home. Ranger had found Thomas in the cold, uncovered the buried contracts, remembered the surveyor, and pulled the old rancher from the path of a rolling truck. Yet his greatest assignment had required no military command. He had taught a proud father to accept help. He had given a grieving veteran a reason to leave his truck. Most importantly, He had shown one wounded family that loyalty did not mean carrying every burden alone. Outside, snow continued falling over land that had survived fire, debt, silence, and fear. Inside, no one was missing from the table. And for the first time in many years, no one was pretending to be fine. The greatest lesson of this story is that strength does not mean carrying every burden alone. Thomas believed silence would protect his family. Daniel believed one more sacrifice could repair every mistake. Abby spent years protecting strangers while failing to see that the people she loved were quietly falling apart. Yet healing began the moment they stopped hiding and chose to face the truth together. Sometimes the miracles God gives us do not arrive as sudden wealth, perfect health, or an easy escape from hardship. Sometimes the miracle is a daughter who returns home at the right moment. Sometimes it is a loyal dog who refuses to leave an old man behind. Sometimes it is a family finally finding the courage to say, "I need help." In our daily lives, we may also hide our pain because we do not want to worry others. We may believe that asking for help makes us weak. But God often sends His love through the hands, voices, and presence of the people around us. We should not wait until tomorrow to call our parents, forgive someone we love, admit a mistake, or sit beside a person who is suffering in silence. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Tell us in the comments what lesson stayed with you the most, and let us know where you are watching from. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, loyalty, courage, and second chances. If you believe that God can restore broken hearts, guide lost families home, and turn painful endings into new beginnings, please comment Amen. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home, comfort your heart, strengthen you through every difficult season, and remind you that you never have to carry the storms of life alone.